So there's another contender for most ridiculous royal story of the week, but I think we might have a winner, because I don't think this is a story. I think it's the one from the previous video where somebody wrote that Meghan needs to apologize, but wouldn't tell us what Meghan needs to apologize for. And they're talking about accountability and taking responsibility and all that, but they didn't tell us what Meghan needs to apologize for. So this particular one is from the same newspaper. And I think it's around the other girl. And apparently, the other girl was furious over a BBC interview that Harry did last year. Now, we know that the other girl, to be honest, she doesn't really deliver anything of substance. So what they try to do is attach Harry and Meghan's name to her. They attach it to emotion.
People really need to ask themselves why these recycled royal fury stories keep appearing every single time there is a slow news cycle, because once you start looking closely at the pattern, the entire thing becomes painfully obvious. And this latest story about the other girl supposedly being furious over Harry's BBC interview from last year is honestly one of the clearest examples yet of how the royal media machine operates. Because let us be serious for a second. This interview happened ages ago. The public reacted to it at the time. The tabloids squeezed every possible headline out of it at the time. The commentators screamed, cried, clutched pearls and slid dramatically down imaginary palace walls at the time. So why exactly are we suddenly revisiting this in 2026, as though some groundbreaking revelation has just landed on humanity? We are revisiting it because they needed content. That is literally it. And not just any content. They needed Harry and Meghan content specifically because nothing generates engagement quite like the Sussexes. That is the reality the royal press cannot escape, no matter how hard they try to convince everyone otherwise. Harry and Meghan are the story. They remain the story. And every time the tabloids pretend otherwise, they end up exposing themselves by attaching Sussex names to absolutely everything. Think about it. If the other girl carries out an engagement by herself, the coverage is polite, predictable, and over within 24 hours. Maybe there is a front page. Maybe there is a segment on morning television talking about her coat dress or her smile, or how wonderfully she waved at somebody standing near a hedge. But by the next news cycle, the public has moved on. Now, compare that to what happens when Harry and Meghan are mentioned. Suddenly, there are endless think pieces, endless opinion columns, endless sources close to the palace, endless emotional breakdowns supposedly happening behind closed doors. Suddenly, the coverage becomes sustained, dramatic and obsessive because the publications know that Harry and Meghan generate clicks in a way nobody else in that family currently can. And this article proves it. Because look at the premise. Apparently, the other girl is furious over Harry's BBC interview. Furious, incandescent with rage, deeply hurt, emotionally devastated. Pick your dramatic tabloid adjective of the week. But where is the evidence? Where is the quote? Where is the actual source? Where is the timeline? Who exactly witnessed this fury? Did she rant to a wall? Did she whisper angrily into a teacup? Did she stare furiously into the middle distance while somebody from the Daily Express hid behind a bush taking notes? Nobody knows, because these articles are built entirely on vague emotional framing designed to trigger engagement rather than provide facts. And this is why media literacy matters so much, because the public is constantly being fed emotional narratives disguised as reporting. They're told somebody is furious, somebody is heartbroken, somebody feels betrayed, somebody feels snubbed. But the actual evidence is almost never there. The publication simply assumes the emotion on behalf of the individual and then packages it into a clickable headline. That is not journalism. That is content farming. And honestly, the funniest part is that they are recycling old material now because they are running out of new angles. The BBC interview itself is ancient news at this point. Harry spoke openly about his security concerns, his family estrangement, and his hopes for reconciliation. People discussed it extensively at the time. The world moved on. Harry moved on. Meghan moved on. Everybody moved on. But the tabloids cannot move on because Sussex stories are their economic lifeline. So they keep reopening old wounds and repackaging old events, hoping people will click again. And unfortunately for them, the desperation is becoming increasingly obvious. Another thing that stood out to me in this article was the way they once again pushed the narrative that the other girl and Harry had this deeply close sibling-like bond before Meghan arrived and ruined everything. They always frame it this way because they need Meghan to be positioned as the disruptive outsider. That framing is absolutely essential to the narrative they are trying to maintain. Now, personally, I do think Harry and the other girl probably got along reasonably well before Meghan entered the picture. They worked together. They attended engagements together. Harry likely supported her in ways we do not even fully know about. There are even photographs where Harry appears more considerate toward her than her own husband does. People have pointed out that famous moment where the other brother walked ahead with the umbrella, while Harry literally turned back toward her as if to say, "What about her?" That happened. People saw it. So, yes, there may well have been warmth there. But close? I am not convinced. And I think the real fracture happened because Harry finally prioritized his own happiness and his own family, instead of maintaining the palace hierarchy where everybody is expected to fall in line behind the institution. Because let us remember what was actually happening during that wedding period. The endless drama over bridesmaids' dresses, the complaints about tights, the arguments over fittings, the tailor sitting there from early morning waiting for adjustments while chaos unfolded around Meghan during what should have been one of the happiest periods of her life. And honestly, Meghan's response told me everything I needed to know. She basically said, "The tailor is available. Please bring your child like every other parent is doing." In other words, this is my wedding, and nobody is receiving special treatment here. And I genuinely think that boundary shocked people, because Meghan was not entering that institution as somebody prepared to shrink herself. She was not prepared to become silent, invisible, or endlessly accommodating simply to make other people comfortable. She had standards, she had confidence, she had her own identity. And certain people interpreted that as arrogance simply because they were not used to somebody refusing to play the palace game. That is why the word difficult keeps appearing around Meghan. And whenever people call a woman difficult, especially a woman who speaks clearly, sets boundaries and refuses to tolerate nonsense, I always ask difficult for who exactly. Because often what they really mean is she would not submit. And Harry clearly saw what was happening. I think the palace genuinely believed he would eventually choose the institution over his wife. They probably assumed the pressure campaigns, the leaks, and the hostility would eventually force him back into line. But Harry chose Meghan, every single time. And I think that decision still enrages certain people, because it disrupted the entire structure they expected him to remain trapped inside forever. Harry basically said, "This is my wife, this is the love of my life, and I am not sacrificing her well-being for people who barely prioritize me when I lived next door to them. And honestly, when you think about it that way, his decision makes perfect sense. The saddest thing about all of this is that instead of reflecting on why Harry left, the institution and the press seem determined to keep recycling blame narratives forever. Every few weeks there is another article about fury, betrayal, heartbreak or reconciliation supposedly collapsing again. It never ends because ending it would mean losing the Sussex content cycle that keeps generating traffic. And that is why these stories keep getting more ridiculous. Because eventually, when there is no actual news left, all they have is recycled emotions and anonymous outrage. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan continue living their lives, raising their children, travelling, working, supporting causes they care about, and existing outside palace control. And somehow that remains the most unforgivable thing of all to certain corners of the royal media. But anyway, let me know what you think, because honestly, this might genuinely be the most ridiculous royal story of the week.